If you were born in the late 1990s like me, then you were also most likely guilty of the same things as me. Like me, you were probably in middle school in the early 2000s, but did you know that we were learning our ABCs and 1, 2, 3s when we should have been investing in real estate? Because if you're under 30 and want to own a house in 2025, better hope you inherit one. Now I know what you're thinking, why am I talking about the real estate market? Isn't this a Broadway video? At first glance, Broadway looks a lot like the current housing market. A handful of names, lots of competition, and the hope that if you just wait long enough, something great will appear. Or reappear. But behind the curtains, Broadway is an industry controlled by 3 major companies, and sadly, much like Chicago on Broadway, it's a rigid structure that just won't seem to go away. The Shubert Organization, the Nederlander Organization, and Jujamcyn Theaters are the 3 key players that essentially dominate the Broadway ecosystem. Together, these 3 companies own a combined 28 Broadway theaters, which is nearly 70% of the 41 total Broadway theaters, with the Shubert Organization owning the most at 17. Together, these 3 companies virtually dictate what shows get produced, who gets access, and what kinds of stories audiences get to experience. So what they say goes. And they're not only the gatekeepers of the physical space to host productions, but they're also the gatekeepers of taste, being the reason that we see less creative risk in the shows that they choose to produce, or why we consistently see more of the same shows being revived. Many people think of Broadway as the Great White Way, this magical place where theater hopefuls flock from all across the world with the hopes of being on the most elite stage for high-quality live productions. Actors, writers, and alike are disappointed to find that Broadway is more insular, monopolistic, and rigid than they could have ever imagined. The most recent Broadway theater to open was the Lyric Theater in 1998, and since then, there have been no new Broadway theaters built in the 21st century. That's not an accident, it's by design. More Broadway theaters means more competition, and the big 3 don't want that. This is because Broadway in its current form is not structured to benefit the artists who make the amazing shows. It is structured to benefit the billion-dollar corporations that control every aspect of the live theater ecosystem. If you watch the 2025 Tonys, you may have heard Cynthia Erivo say this.
Also, this was Broadway's most financially lucrative year ever.
Broadway is making more money. This is amazing. Although, this is not because more people are going to Broadway, it's because the prices of Broadway tickets are at an all-time high. But who is benefiting from those price increases on tickets? Surely, since Broadway is making so much money, the artists are getting paid more, right? Broadway maintains an illusion of creative vibrancy, but directly manufactures the Broadway stagnation that recent years have especially experienced. In this video, I'll break down a brief history of Broadway, how the current Broadway landscape came to be, why the 1995 Tonys serve as a case study in Broadway's stagnation, what audiences are missing because of this ecosystem, the near impossible barriers to entry for new artists, and what it might take to make Broadway feel less broken. If you're watching this video, I assume that you're familiar with Broadway in some capacity, but how far exactly back does Broadway go? How did Broadway become Broadway? In the late 19th century, New York City experienced an immigration boom, going from a couple 100,000 residents in the mid-19th century to a couple million by the year 1900. At the turn of the century, the world was experiencing a shift from industrialization to modernization, with mass forms of entertainment becoming very appealing to the general public. The idea of what we now consider a modern Broadway theater doesn't actually originate in the 20th century. New York City has had large-scale theaters dating back to at least the 1750s, but it wasn't until the early 1900s that the Broadway theater district as we know it truly began to take shape, with many iconic theaters being built during that time, some of which are still standing today. People debate what the true oldest operating Broadway theater is, but as far as I can tell, here are the facts. 3 different theaters opened in the year 1903 that are still operating today: the Lyceum Theater, the New Amsterdam Theater, and the Hudson Theater. The oldest by technicality is the Hudson Theater, as it opened on October 19, 1903. However, the Hudson Theater was a TV studio for several decades, and the New Amsterdam Theater was a movie theater for several decades as well, meaning the Lyceum Theater is the only Broadway theater that has remained a Broadway theater since it opened. By the 1910s, more Broadway theaters had opened, with roughly a dozen by the late 1920s. A majority of those theaters were independently owned and operated, often by families or independent producers. However, with the Great Depression just around the corner, and many people struggling to get by, many of those families sold their theaters. And who did they sell them to? Enter in brother trio Samuel, Jacob, and Lee Shubert, otherwise known as the Shubert brothers. Together, the Shubert brothers gobbled up many of the theaters built in the early 20th century. By the mid-1930s, after decades of buyouts, the Shuberts controlled more Broadway real estate than anyone else, a dominance that sadly still exists nearly 100 years later. By the 1950s, the Shubert Organization owned nearly half of all available Broadway theaters, looking to buy more. This led the US government to file an antitrust lawsuit in 1947 to reduce their control over Broadway bookings and theater operations. The US government viewed the Shubert Organization and competitors as a cartel, controlling nearly all theater bookings, limiting opportunities for independent producers by limiting access to venues, and controlling ticket sales and production choices, essentially creating a monopoly on Broadway theater production. And in 1953, the courts agreed with the US government, finding the Shubert Organization in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, forcing them to change their restrictive booking policies and control over productions. However, ironically, the lawsuit did not require them to sell any of their Broadway theaters. In fact, their portfolio expanded and they continued to acquire even more Broadway theaters without government intervention. While the Shubert Organization was busy fending off monopoly charges in court, another family was quietly plotting their own Broadway takeover, with far fewer legal headaches. The Nederlander family's rise in Broadway theater ownership began with David Nederlander, who built a successful theater portfolio in Detroit, Michigan. His sons, James and Robert Nederlander, eventually expanded the family business beyond the Midwest. Taking advantage of struggling New York City real estate in the 1950s and 60s, they began acquiring Broadway theaters, a bold move at a time when few others were investing in the real estate market. Their holdings grew even further during the economic downturn of the 1970s and 80s, when many independent theater owners were forced to sell following the stock market crash. And believe it or not, our third cartel leader was plotting their hostile thespian takeover at the same time as Shubert and Nederlander. Great minds think alike, I guess? Anyways, in 1957, Jujamcyn Theaters was founded by William McKnight, a theater lover and a chairman to everyone's favorite stick-this-thing-on-the-wall product company, 3M. McKnight founded Jujamcyn Theaters to pay homage to his three grandchildren, Judith, James, and Cynthia. Jujamcyn formally entered the Broadway real estate market in 1976, when they acquired the prestigious and iconic St. James Theater, still one of the most formidable Broadway houses to this day. And it must have been very profitable, because almost a decade later, Jujamcyn owned a total of 5 Broadway theaters by the late 1980s, and it's only gotten worse since then. Before I list every current Broadway theater, it's important to note what a Broadway theater is defined as, in case you're curious. Essentially, in 1949, the Actors' Equity Association needed to distinguish wages for actors based on the size of the theater for union contract purposes, establishing that Broadway theaters need to be a minimum of 500 seats. By the 1950s, the 500-seat minimum became the official industry standard to define a Broadway theater, used both for Tony Awards eligibility through the Broadway League and for actors' union contracts. I want to highlight every current Broadway theater and clearly show who owns and operates each one so you understand exactly where your money goes when you buy a Broadway ticket. Starting with the largest of the big three, the convicted antitrust queen herself, the Shubert Organization. The Shubert Organization owns 17 Broadway theaters that they also operate. They own the Ambassador Theater, the Belasco Theater, the Bernard B. Jacobs Theater, the Booth Theater, the Broadway Theater, the Broadhurst Theater, the Ethel Barrymore Theater, the Gerald Schoenfeld Theater, the Imperial Theater, the James Earl Jones Theater, the John Golden Theater, the Longacre Theater, the Lyceum Theater, the Majestic Theater, the Music Box Theater, the Shubert Theater, and the Winter Garden Theater. Next up, we have the Nederlander Organization. The Nederlander Organization currently owns 6 theaters. They own the Luntfontein Theater, the Nederlander Theater, the Neil Simon Theater, the Palace Theater, the Richard Rogers Theater, and the Lena Horne Theater. It's important to note that Nederlander has multi-decade-long leases to operate the Gershwin, Marquis, and Minskoff theaters, so while they have large investments in these buildings, they do not own them outright, but they operate them nonetheless. The last of the big three is Jujamcyn Theaters, which merged with the Ambassador Theater Group in July of 2023. While the Jujamcyn name remains, ATG is now the parent company and maintains control over the 5 theaters in their combined portfolio. They own the Al Hirschfeld Theater, the August Wilson Theater, the Eugene O'Neill Theater, the St. James Theater, and the Walter Kerr Theater, but they long-term lease an additional 2 theaters. The City and State of New York owns the Todd Hames Theater, which they lease to Roundabout Theater Company, the Lyric Theater, which they lease to Ambassador Theater Group, and the New Amsterdam Theater, which is on a long-term lease with Disney Theatrical Group. Paramount Group owns the Circle in the Square Theater and the Gershwin Theater. Roundabout Theater Company owns Studio 54, Lincoln Center Theater owns the Vivian Beaumont Theater, Second Stage Theater owns the Hayes Theater, formerly known as the Helen Hayes Theater, the Durst Organization owns the Stephen Sondheim Theater, which they lease to Roundabout Theater Company, Millennium Hotels and Resorts owns the Hudson Theater, which is leased to Ambassador Theater Group, Manhattan Theater Club owns the Samuel J. Friedman Theater, S.L. Green Realty owns the Minskoff Theater, and Vornado Trust Realty owns the Marquis Theater. This is the current Broadway ecosystem. The pie chart on screen reflects the correct ownership percentages of every company or entity that owns a Broadway theater, with the big three owning a combined 70% of all Broadway houses, roughly 2 in every 3 theaters. While Shubert is the obvious perpetrator of market dominance, keep in mind that both Nederlander and ATG operate more venues than they own, so their control over pricing and shows is even more than the 70% that they outright own. When you factor in the additional venues that they lease or operate, their market dominance rises closer to 80%. Despite being the 4th largest Broadway theater owner with 3, the City of New York has little to no influence because they're not playing the same game as the big 3. They don't curate seasons, they don't favor revivals or IP-driven shows, nor do they have a central artistic mission. It's worth mentioning that each of the big 3 has had a contentious relationship with unions as well, including IATSE, Actors Equity, and the Musicians Union, especially when it comes to livable wages or guaranteed health insurance. So how did we get here? Why has nothing changed since the 1990s? Why has the US government looked the other way while a monopoly quietly took over the cultural centerpiece of American theater? The simple answer? Prestige. Because Broadway isn't just a business, it's a dream. And if you make it sound sacred enough, no one will ask who's truly profiting behind the curtains. Broadway is still seen as the crown jewel of American live theater, a somewhat elitist institution where becoming a star, or winning a Tony, is a lifelong dream for many performers. It's the same prestige that creates a kind of soft justification, the belief that because the rewards are so high, the rigid barriers to entry are acceptable. In other words, if the dream is big enough, the gatekeeping feels deserved. Broadway is a very convoluted ecosystem where unions, theater landlords, real estate, and tourism all intertwine, albeit it's mostly confined to a single area in Midtown Manhattan. If the US government wanted to sort out Broadway, it would've and could've decades ago. It's intentionally stagnant because there's a willful ignorance toward Broadway's barriers to entry for up-and-coming artists. The entire thing has a very baby boomer, I went through hell so you should go through hell too mentality, like the people that are older and still support unpaid internships. This creates a halo effect around Broadway, where its cultural significance becomes more important than the potential revenue it can generate. Unfortunately, because Broadway has such an American foundation, any criticism of Broadway is seen as anti-American to a lot of people. This is why media outlets rarely criticize Broadway as an industry. There are countless Broadway channels dedicated to people criticizing specific shows or performers, but rarely do people criticize the structures behind Broadway. Because it's not even just the physical real estate these companies own. They are the arbiters of taste, and they hold the key to your show being a success or never seeing the light of day at all. Even if by some miracle you somehow manage to get your foot in the door at one of the big 3 theater organizations, let's say you've written the greatest musical of the 21st century. Guess what? Your problems don't end there. Next, you have to face an even bigger challenge: the people who get special privileges on Broadway. There's a small circle of powerful producers who can fast-track just about anything to Broadway. They can bypass the usual years-long development process, secure significantly more resources, and land a hotspot theater in a fraction of the time that it takes most creators. While others are stuck in workshop hell, watching their shows die in regional theater limbo, these one percenters get to skip the line entirely. People like Andrew Lloyd Webber, Scott Rudin, and David Stone can essentially demand what they want, when they want it, even if the material isn't ready. That's how shows like Bad Cinderella make it to Broadway. A musical that clearly needed at least 10 more drafts was given a prime venue because Andrew Lloyd Webber was attached to the project. It's the same for the Almost Famous musical in 2023, Diana the musical in 2021, the Last Ship musical in 2014, the Spider-Man musical in 2011, the list goes on and on. It's how Idina Menzel landed a top-tier theater for her 2025 Tree musical Redwood, a somber, oddly personal show that probably wouldn't have seen the light of day if she wasn't attached. Dozens of shows continue to secure prime location theaters solely because of the high-profile names attached to them, and more often than not, these projects are revivals. And because of those same producers who revive the same shows, it leads into the conversation about blind casting. One of the most prominent conversations in the theater community has been about blind casting, the idea that roles traditionally played by white actors can and should be open to actors of any race. In theory, this is considered generally progressive, but in practice, it has led to debates over whether people of color are being cast for the sake of optics rather than talent, reducing entire performances to preference instead of skill. But what's often missed in this conversation, however, is what's not being produced. While people are distracted by the debate over blind casting, I find myself asking a different question. Why aren't producers greenlighting original works that reflect diversity by creation, not just by casting? Blind casting, for all its potential, is often used as a cover, a way for largely white-led institutions to appear inclusive without actually investing in new work by creators of color. It allows the existing power structures to stay intact, while offering tokenized opportunities within stories that were never written with these communities in mind. The harsh reality is, many producers, the majority of whom are white, would rather cast actors of color into familiar, profitable IP than take a chance on original material authored by marginalized voices. It's safer, it's easier, and sadly, more palatable to risk-averse investors. With the rare exception of shows like Porgy and Bess, nearly every major revival centers around white narratives. That's not surprising anymore, it's just disappointing. Broadway likes to brand itself as a hub of diversity and inclusion, but in reality, it's one of the most gate-kept creative industries in America. It has made a fortune off of the backs of the very communities that it systematically excludes. It is not enough to cast black and brown faces in old white stories. The big three should be funding, staging, and uplifting new narratives, ones written by the artists who have always been referenced but rarely focused on. If Broadway is to survive, it has to move beyond diversity as an aesthetic choice and into diversity as authorship. Each passing year, Broadway's lineup feels increasingly repetitive, filled with familiar revivals, reviews, and remakes, whether of hit musicals from the past or adaptations of popular films and television series. That's because Broadway now operates similar to Disney, heavily reliant on nostalgia bait, banking on reinterpretations of modern classics instead of taking new and creative risks. Just to illustrate how deep this really runs, here are a few shows and the number of times that they've been revived. Porgy and Bess is the most revived musical with at least 7 revivals. The Three Penny Opera and Showboat both have at least 6 revivals, while Guys and Dolls, Fiddler on the Roof, Carousel, Oklahoma, Gypsy, The King and I, Man of La Mancha, West Side Story, Camelot, Brigadoon, Cabaret, Jesus Christ Superstar have all had at least 4 revivals each. Even in 2025, the most buzzed about categories at the Tonys were dominated by 2 revivals and their lead actresses, Nicole Scherzinger in Sunset Boulevard and Audra McDonald in Gypsy. This past year, I overheard more about the revivals than I did about any new original musicals. And year after year, the conversation starts to feel like deja vu. Each new Broadway season announces more of the same musicals, while truly exciting, original work gets harder to find. Still don't understand what I mean by deja vu? Let me take you back 30 years. The 1995 Tonys were honestly a bit of a joke. Because of the lack of new musicals on Broadway to nominate during the 94 to 95 season, Best Musical only had 2 nominees. The immediately iconic Sunset Boulevard from Andrew Lloyd Webber, and then Smokey Joe's Cafe. One is obviously a rework of the movie musical from the 1950s, and the other is a jukebox review with no book. It was obvious that Sunset Boulevard would win, and everyone watching kind of knew that, which made the Tony ceremony very boring. Because of the Big Three's over-reliance on revivals during the '95 Broadway season, many of which failed critically or commercially, Tony eligibility across multiple categories was historically thin. As a result, 3 musicals dominated most of all of the awards telecast: Sunset Boulevard, Smokey Joe's Cafe, and the revival of Showboat. Between those 3 shows, they filled 13 of the 14 available musical acting nomination slots. Sunset Boulevard swept the Tonys, not necessarily because it was beloved, but because there was basically no competition. In addition to winning Best Musical, Andrew Lloyd Webber also won Best Original Score, simply because he was the only other nominee in that category, so he basically won by default. Glenn Close won Best Actress in a Musical for Sunset Boulevard, but it was essentially a 50-50 coin toss. The only other nominee was Rebecca Luker in Showboat. By the mid-1990s, Broadway had become increasingly dependent on celebrity name recognition and name brand IP. And just like today, there was more competition among old shows than new ones, a clear warning sign of industry stagnation. Within the current Broadway ecosystem, many previously beloved shows become forgotten to time. Because we don't have any feasible way of seeing many shows from prior decades in a video format of some kind, there is a growing list of shows that have never had a Broadway revival. They essentially opened one time, and if you didn't see that one singular Broadway run, it's gone for good. And that seems inherently unfair to the art form. It means very few works will ever reach their full audience potential. How can we know if a revival will be the next Sunset Boulevard if it's just sitting on a shelf? There are several successful Broadway shows that have never had revivals, but could be updated with modern casting to revive interest. The musical Bubbling Brown Sugar, a celebration of Harlem nightlife, premiered in 1976 on Broadway and became one of the first commercially successful Broadway shows built around Black cultural history. But even in 2025, it has not seen the light of day on Broadway since. The musical A Day in Hollywood, A Night in the Ukraine opened in 1980 on Broadway and was a cult favorite, but has essentially been lost to time. The mega hit musical Titanic from 1997 was a smash at the box office, but surprisingly is almost never brought up for a revival. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the shows that simply won't fucking close. Most shows get a few months worth of performances, while a very niche, lucky few get to enjoy multiple decades of ticket sales. The longest running show in Broadway history is infamously The Phantom of the Opera, which opened on Broadway in 1988 and ran for a historic 35 years, ending in 2023. Of the shows still currently running on Broadway, Chicago holds the record as the longest running revival when it was revived in 1996, and for some reason is still going strong almost 30 years later, despite being one of the most glaring examples of a show that should have probably taken its final bow over a decade ago. Not far behind is The Lion King, which opened in 1997, just 1 year after Chicago's revival. Then there's Wicked, which has been defying gravity since 2003, 22 years after its premiere, making it the last and most recent show to cross the rare 20-year mark on Broadway. Cats opened in 1982 and ran for 18 years before closing in 2000. Les Miserables premiered in 1987 and closed in 2003 after 16 years. Mamma Mia ran for 14 years, opening in 2001 and closing in 2015. The Book of Mormon has been running on Broadway since its premiere in 2011 and is still performing today. The musical Hamilton recently marked its 10th anniversary on Broadway, having debuted in 2015. While show sticking around is not inherently a bad thing, in Broadway's rigid ecosystem, where theaters are scarce and risk-taking is rare, these long-term squatter shows of Broadway start to feel less like beloved staples and more like landlords blocking the next generation of shows from emerging. Many prominent producers will often deflect blame onto rising production costs as the reason they rely so heavily on pre-existing intellectual property. And to a degree, they're right. Broadway is more expensive than ever before. The already sky-high barriers to entry become nearly insurmountable when most of the financial risk falls on the creative team itself, not the theaters or landlords. The big three theater owners will make their money no matter how a show performs, but when a show does succeed, they profit immensely. As of available 2025 data, the average new musical costs upwards of $10 to $15 million just to reach opening night. Want name brand actors in your cast? Add a few million. Want a prime theater location? Add a couple $100,000. The costs balloon quickly, and with nearly 80% of Broadway shows failing to break even, many closing within 6 months, it's no wonder producers are so risk-averse. In 2025, shows typically need to make around $700,000 to $1 million per week in order to remain profitable. This is another reason that shows that are even a mild hit are still forced to close after a few months because they failed to break even with their weekly operating costs. Because most new shows can't afford to stay open without miracle blockbuster success, Broadway has adopted a rapid churn model, crowding each new Broadway season with more and more productions. So when Cynthia Erivo says,
This was Broadway's most financially lucrative year ever,
the real question is, who's actually winning? It's certainly not the actors. A large portion of Broadway performers don't even have consistent health insurance. So if Broadway is generating record-breaking profits, where is all that money going? The truth is, there's an illusion of choice on Broadway. There's too many new shows, but too few theaters to host them. But Broadway isn't flooded with new shows because it's thriving. It's because most shows just can't afford to stay open. The hidden truth about Broadway isn't pretty. What lies behind the curtain is not some masked man, or a green witch, or Alexander Hamilton. It's the three multi-billion-dollar corporations convincing you that you have choices when you don't. Only 3 companies own or operate nearly 80% of all Broadway theaters. No matter how bold or original your new show is, the big 3 are largely your barriers to entry. It's not about artistic merit, it's about business. The average cost to mount a new Broadway musical is $10 million or more, meaning it's virtually impossible for young, independent producers to compete without corporate backing or a wealthy angel investor. Revivals, movie adaptations, and jukebox musicals make up nearly half of every Broadway season, while original, risky storytelling continues waiting in the wings. Theaters stay clogged for decades by legacy productions like Chicago and The Lion King, stifling new work. Many landmark Black plays and musicals have never been revived once, even ones that were historic hits. Broadway preaches diversity, but the revival slate each season rarely reflects it. Major producers like Andrew Lloyd Webber and Scott Rudin get first dibs on theaters and dates. Even their shows that fail get better real estate than most newcomers could dream of. Audiences are paying record ticket prices for Broadway shows, but the financial risk remains entirely on the starving artists, while the big 3 get paid regardless of a show's success. Even if a flop show loses millions, the theater owner always wins. Everyone agrees that Broadway deserves a streaming platform. Only a fraction of shows are lucky enough to be recorded for TV or available on a streaming service. But the real reason that a Broadway streaming platform hasn't happened is because the big 3 would lose money on the physical real estate that they control. Because at the end of the day, it's not about preserving the theater art form. It's about preserving scarcity for profit. The US government has no interest in intervening in Broadway's monopoly, partly out of apathy for the artists it exploits, and partly out of fear that disrupting the system could hurt the profits that Broadway brings in. The Broadway ecosystem that we have today is the direct product of decades of control by the big 3, allowing them to steadily raise prices and widen their profit margins, while the artists who power the industry are left struggling to survive. Broadway is more monopolized now than at any other time in its history. The dream of an open, competitive, artist-driven Broadway ecosystem is just that, a dream. If this video made you see Broadway in a new light, I would appreciate if you would drop a like or a comment below letting me know your thoughts. And if you want more deep dives into the smoke and mirrors of pop culture, consider subscribing to my channel.